Take it away.
All right. So, in case you don't know, Mark's a dear friend. So you might think I'm biased, but anyone would say that Mark's humility and skill has created a story of inspiration, a reminder of how politics and political life once was. And put simply, it is a perfect and wonderful book. So with that, we'll start the conversation before we lose any internet. So Mark, we often think that we know what informed John McCain. He's the son and grandson of two four-star admirals, admirable admirals. But given that his mother of 108, Roberta McCain, passed away yesterday, I've heard you say that it was her being that informed who he was as much as those legendary men. So tell us about it.
Well, just a few words about Roberta, who did pass away at 108 yesterday, peacefully at her home. She had one of those old pre-war apartment buildings on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, where she's lived with her husband and lived the 40 years after her husband passed away. She was the most charming person I ever met in my life. She was a force of nature. She was vivacious, hilarious, bold, risk-taking, endlessly curious, self-starter of a woman. Just an extraordinary human being, and it was a great privilege to know her. She was, I think, the biggest influence on John McCain's life. His father and grandfather were, his father to a lesser extent than his grandfather, were basically legends to him. McCain was born into an illustrious military family going all the way back to the Revolution. He was 9 years old when his grandfather died at the end of World War II, and he was an adult when his father died. But his father was away all the time at sea, and even when he wasn't at sea, he was at work in the Defense Department or in his office, wherever they were located. His mother drove them back and forth from base to base across country, saw to his education, saw that every trip included stops at cultural landmarks and museums and natural wonders. And she's just this very curious, very well-read. They're all read. His entire family were extremely well-read. And many people don't know this. John McCain was probably the most well-read person I've ever met. He was a voracious reader. He'd read anything, fiction and nonfiction. But she was her resilience in adversity, her enthusiasm for life, her endless curiosity, he inherited all those traits from her, and he knew it. He was aware of it, and he said so many times, "I'm my mother's son." Anyway, that's.
In one of the things that I thought was interesting reading the book, Mark, there are a lot of stories that we know. The most classic being he was a POW.
Right.
But I was so struck when I was reading about it, just really on a granular level, understanding the kind of resilience and courage it took to turn down amnesty by his captors.
Right.
So remind us exactly what had happened and what state he was in and why he turned it down.
Well, it was a little less than a year after his shoot down. So he was shot down in October of 1967 over Hanoi, which was at the time the most heavily air-defended city in the history of warfare. It was a Soviet system that had been sent up concentric rings of surface-to-air missiles that would drive pilots to try to duck their airplanes under the missiles, and that's when the anti-aircraft would get most of them. A surface-to-air missile actually tore off his wing. When he pulled the ejection handle, he was upside down and broke both arms and one leg in the ejection. He landed in a lake in the middle of Hanoi, a 5-minute drive from the prison. So as he used to joke, escape and evasion class really wasn't very useful. They dragged him out of there. He could only inflate his life jacket with by pulling the toggle with his teeth. When they dragged him ashore, someone stabbed him with a bayonet a couple of times, and they were beating him until an army truck arrived, threw him in the back, and took him to a cell. And the prison was known as Wa Lo, which means in Vietnamese fiery furnace. It was a French-built trapezoid-shaped prison in the very center of Hanoi, made of sandstone, I believe. And they threw him in a cell there by himself and essentially left him there to die. He was too injured. They didn't think he'd survive. He had just months earlier been on a different carrier than the one he flew off of when he was shot down. He was on the USS Forrestal, which had a terrible fire that actually started when a plane across the flight deck from McCain's plane accidentally misfired a Zuni rocket that struck McCain's fuel tank. And the result was 131 people died and the ship almost sunk. It was a terrible tragedy. He survived it, and the pool reporter that was flown out at the time was Johnny Apple of the New York Times. He and McCain struck up a friendship, so that when he was shot down, he got, I think, a first page notice in the New York Times. Admiral's son, Lieutenant Commander John S. McCain, shot down over Hanoi. So the Vietnamese knew who he was, and they ran in and said, "Okay, you're an admiral's son. Now we'll take you to the hospital." So they took him to a hospital, tried unsuccessfully to settle out of his broken bones, eventually just slapped a body cast on him. And he started to decline. He got dysentery. He couldn't eat. He lost a ton of weight. So they dumped him in a cell with a couple of other prisoners who nursed him to some semblance of health. But he was still, a year later, in July of '68, he was still very, very ill, probably weighed a little more than 100 pounds. And unbeknownst to him, his father had been promoted to, the military acronym is CINC-PAC. It means Commander in Chief of all U.S. military in the Pacific, which included all U.S. military in the Republic of Vietnam. So they had offered him amnesty and said, we're going to send you home. Would you like to go home? All you got to do is, say yes and sign here and do this. The prisoner code of conduct that they all learned before they were ever in combat was that prisoners were supposed to return home, be repatriated in the order of when they arrived. And so he said, "No, I can't." And they said, "Well, think about it. You're sick. They make exceptions for sick, And he went back and secretly tapped on the wall to the guy in the cell next to him. He was in solitary by now too. He had gotten a little healthier, and they put him in solitary. And but he had a guy on the other side of the wall, an Air Force pilot named Bob Craner, that he was extremely close to. And they tapped back and forth. And Craner recommended, "Go home. You're sick enough. Nobody will think the worst of it." But he felt very strongly that the Vietnamese would use it as they would intend to use it to demoralize the other POWs. The admiral's son gets to go home. You guys are stuck here till the end. You're never going home. We're never letting you go. And so he refused, and I think he refused, several times in several separate meetings with this guy that was sort of the political cadre over all the prisoner of war camps, a guy they called the Cat. The prisoners called the Cat, and he always described it to me. He said, when I went to tell him the last time, when he said, "What is your final answer?" He said, he noticed a copy, a somewhat dated copy, but a copy of the New York Times sitting at the little table that the Cat was sitting at, open to an Art Bookwald column, I guess, if memory serves. And when he said, "My final answer is no," he said the Cat snapped his ink pen and ink went all over the paper. And they took him back to his cell. One of the guards said, "Now things will be bad for you." And it took a few weeks, but they were bad. They took him to a special room and basically beat him bloody for days on end. Re-broke his arm, I think, one of his arms, and kept hounding him to make some kind of propaganda statement, which, after I think 3 days of torture, he made. And so something that he said, I've been ashamed of it ever since. Most people tell him, including the other prisoners, you only resist for as long as you're able. And many prisoners obviously broke under days and days of torture. You made these ridiculous, stilted propaganda tapes, but he did. And he always worried that and his father, he always worried his father would hear it because his father was in his chain of command. And his father did hear it, did hear a recording of it. Never said anything to him, though, but his father never spoke of his son while he was in prison. I'm giving you a long
No,
answer.
it's good.
Interrupt me because you always tell me shorter.
Yeah.
His father never spoke of him when he was in prison. And people were warned when they went in to meet the admiral, don't bring up his son. He doesn't like to speak about him. But he was very religious, Admiral McCain, and he prayed on his knees every night, and he prayed aloud. And his mother, the admiral's wife, would hear him praying for Johnny. And every Thanksgiving and Christmas, he would spend with the Marines at the forward operating base, forward fire bases up along the DMZ. And at the end of the meal, every time, they said, and we've gotten testimonials from Marine after Marine after Marine at all the different fire bases, that he would walk to the end of the runway or whatever the furthest northern extension of the base was, and look north after dinner and smoke a cigar, looking in the direction of his son.
So Mark, when I read that, aside from not even imagining how that's possible, it seemed inconsistent with some element of John McCain. He was a bit of a rascal.
Yeah.
He, both at Episcopal, where he went to high school, and at the academy, he wasn't considered the most buttoned up guy.
No.
So at that moment, what was informing him? Was it his
code? He was a man with lousy, poor discipline, impetuous, hot-tempered, loved to sort of butt heads with authority. Didn't buckle under very easily, and traits that stayed with him over the years. But he was the institutions in which he was something of a rebel. Episcopal boarding school in Alexandria, Virginia, where he went to high school, and the United States Naval Academy. He was careful to make sure he told you. He said, I respected their honor codes and I never violated them. And he also had codes that his father and grandfather had. An officer never lies, cheats, or steals. He never sloughs off his responsibilities to his subordinates. He never, all various other codicils to the rule, but he sort of inherited those from his parents and the code he got from the literature. I mentioned before what a good reader was. He loved fiction, and he particularly loved Hemingway. And what some people refer to as the old Hemingway BS. But the notion that you redeem yourself through acts of courage and self-sacrifice in service of others, that was very much probably John McCain's core conviction in life. And those things, he had the prisoner of war code of conduct that he followed to, the spirit of. But so, yes, he was a rascal. He had his good qualities, and he had a few colorful, not so great qualities. But he was an honorable man who had an honor code, and he stuck to it by and large all the days of his life.
And as a boss, you saw as
my boss,
as your boss. Although I've heard you boss him around.
Yeah. I had some days when he was in a good mood, I could.
Now you both had bad tempers, so how'd you manage those relative tempers?
Well, it's funny so I was first hired to be a foreign affairs aide and a writer for him, and he loved writing, and so he loved to be involved in that. And but after a couple of years, he asked me to be. We called ourselves administrative assistants then. We had no need of the inflated title chief of staff, but now I think that's gone to the wayside, and everybody's a chief of staff, no matter how small the staff is. But I did become his AA, administrative assistant. And he asked me to, and he said, "Yeah, there's just one thing." I said, "Why?" He goes, "We both have hot tempers." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "One of us should do something about that." And making it clear he meant me. So I tried to curb mine and let him express his when he felt the need.
Mark, when You know, you were working on the railroad without a college degree. I think you say in the book you were short on ambition and long on attitude.
Yeah.
And then you end up as the chief of staff of one of the most powerful U.S. senators. That's not exactly the normal rocket ship to that position. How'd you get from point A to point B?
Just kismet. I mean, really, you just make one decision, you get lucky, and something comes up. It's not. There's no rhyme or reason for it. I got tired of. I was in a. I mean, it was a fine job in terms of. I was a young kid, and but in the early 1970s, and I think I was getting $4 or $5 an hour or something, which seemed like a lot of money at the time. I had a car and an apartment. And,
Good, check those boxes.
but it was a railroad that ran along the Mississippi River, and it was very hot in the summer and very, very cold in the wintertime. And I decided that after 4 years of that, I could probably find an easier way to make a living. So I decided I'd go back to college, and I went to a state school in Iowa for a couple of years, and a teacher encouraged me to transfer to Georgetown. I went to Georgetown. I met Jeane Kirkpatrick and people around Jeane Kirkpatrick. I got a job at the UN when she was there. I was with her in the Republican convention in New Orleans in 1988 when I met John McCain's press secretary, who introduced me not only to John McCain, but to his scheduler, who would eventually become my wife.
The mother of your two girls.
And it was all just luck. Honestly, just luck.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that one, but
it's true.
Let's go to a couple of the legislative things. There's one story in here that I was very taken aback by. So McCain, as we know, was very interested in campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
He was getting the bill. He was doing all the good political stuff to get it in good place. And then Mitch McConnell did something that, to my reading, was incredibly nasty. And I'm like sitting there thinking, yeah, I'm really, McCain and Mark must have been furious with this guy. And then I get to the end of the book.
Yeah.
And I read another view of McConnell. So explain what McConnell did.
Well, this was, okay, so McCain was running for president at the time on the early end of the campaign. And he was also championing campaign finance reform. There was some resentment among Republican senators at the time that McCain got a lot of press attention and a lot of favorable notice. He was on Sunday shows, you know, back when Sunday shows were must-watch TV for people in politics. And you know, they felt there. I think there's some genuinely. You got to be careful about how you express yourself sometimes. And I think there was genuinely some resentment that McCain's pitch on campaign finance reform made them all made his colleagues sound like they were crooks or something. I understand that, and I think he understood it after a bit. But what McConnell did was challenge him on the floor. Well, you said that the current system is corrupting us. Who's corrupt? Name us. Name which ones. Now, anybody that's worked on Capitol Hill, even in those days, which were less polarized than they are today, have seen instances where major donors have gotten something that they wouldn't have got otherwise, that weren't exactly consistent with, you know, they got somebody to vote their way in a way that was not particularly consistent with the way that member of the Senate or House would have voted if they had been free to vote their views or thought they were free to vote their views. And there are plenty of examples of it. And even McCain would have copped to instances where this guy's, you know, important to me. But you don't, you know, you really don't want to cross that line and start fingering people. So they knew he couldn't answer. And there were 3 senators that did it, one of whom was a friend, and tried to be upfront about it, told him he was going to do that. And but I put McCain, I was on the floor with him, the Senate floor, when this was going on, and it was going back and forth, and he was trying not to name names, but then he sort of referenced something that had happened when he had sponsored tobacco legislation, where the tobacco companies had promised Republicans that they would run ads supporting them if they voted against the tobacco bill. And he referenced that, and McConnell batted it aside. But it was a tense and unpleasant moment. Do you want me to go on the end? But we tend, it's a mistake, especially if you're going to have a long time in politics, to make permanent enemies. You're just not a very effective person. And you also, I think when we look at politicians, we don't apply the same sort of, we don't give them the grace we give other people in other professions or people in our lives who we see as fully three-dimensional characters, not one or two-dimensional, as we see most politicians. And, you know, so for many years, McCain's and McConnell's office, they butted heads over campaign finance and other issues many times, but their offices were across the hall for about 10 or 15 years. You go to work with these guys every day. You spend long, long hours with them. You talk to them every day about this, that, or the other thing, even if you're fighting with them. Even if, you know, you don't, you know, you're not there at their birthday party or something, but, you know, you become familiarity, and this, you know, sort of breeds a familial type quality to these relationships. You know, like you might have the brother or cousin you butt heads with every once in a while. They're still your cousin. And so when McCain was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, privately, McConnell was tremendously emotional. When John went to see him, he was really quite undone by it. And you know, the 30 years of working, you know, together, you know, even against each other, but in the same place, it will do that to you.
So you talk about that we don't think of politicians as multidimensional, but I mean, I would think most people would say it feels different now. Is it, are we not giving them credit, or is it different?
No, it's different. And you know, look, I left the Senate to go work on the 2008 campaign, and that was it. I didn't go back. I stayed associated with John McCain and worked for his political committees and for him till he died. But I didn't go back to the Senate, which I regret. But it definitely has gotten worse. But it may be a little bit that I'm now doing what I've accused the general viewer of doing, which is just not judging these guys by the same standards I would apply to people in my own life or in other professions. And but it's gotten it's gotten you know, when you become a politically powerful person, you've got a lot of people telling you how great you are and everything. So arrogance isn't uncommon, and it never has been in politics. You know, going back, I suppose, to you know the very beginning of government. But I
mean, there were pistols in Congress at one point.
So it's, when I say this, it's going to sound like, so what's new? But they just seem to have lost some humility. That, you know, they were there to get something done, and the way to get something done in our government, and this is on the left and right. It really is. Right now, I think the Republican Party is 10 years down a bad track, or 5 years down a bad track ahead of, you know, some elements of the Democratic Party. But this idea that we're going to have it all our way all the time, it doesn't work in our system of government. The most you can do is 3 yards in a cloud of dust, and that's an honorable achievement. If you take the problems that show in your inbox, go and ask for 55 or 60% of your point of view with somebody across the aisle from you, come to terms on it, and get something done for the American people. Not everything done. You know, now we've got the system where, oh, Obama comes in, we're going to have Obamacare, and Republicans come in, we're going to throw Obamacare out. Oh, you know, Trump comes in, you know, we're going to have this tax code, and now we're going to throw it out. And it's, you know, they've gone ahead and all the things you think you don't like about the Senate, the filibuster, primarily, are actually things that induce people to compromise, you know, or used to, you know, and the more of those you get rid of, the more norms and customs and institutional rules you get rid of, the more and the less and less able the place is to shake hands on a deal and get something done. And it's gotten to the point where it's almost total paralysis. You know, it's
well, it seems like, you know, looking at all the different legislative things that you talk about. So I think it was 2013 when the immigration bill came to the Senate, and
the last one.
And it passed the Senate with pretty good majority, right? 60 something.
67 votes.
And yet,
veto proof.
Paul Ryan would not let it get brought up in the House. Yeah. And that seemed to me the beginning. So what was going on in the Republican Party there?
I think it was Boehner then.
It was Boehner. Oh, it was Boehner. It was Boehner. I'm telling you, it was Boehner.
Boehner's, Boehner, who I guarantee you understood the value of that comprehensive compromise of an immigration bill that had, many Republicans in the Senate on board, the Obama administration on board. He understood it, but he had this caucus. I mean, this Freedom Caucus, which is sort of the guys that the most Tea Partyist of the Tea Party wave members in the House, that said no to everything. It would go after him and try to cost him his speakership and just make a nuisance of themselves and force him into this position. Now, what he should have done is put it up for a general vote, and he would have carried easily, because not all Democrats, the AFL-CIO wasn't thrilled by the bill, but most Democrats, the overwhelming majority of Democrats and a sizable number of Republicans would have passed it in the House. But he felt there would have been a rebellion in his ranks, and so he never brought it to the floor. I think that was an error in judgment on his part. We would have addressed the immigration problem with a sensible, practical solution instead of this phony business now of Trump building a fake wall. It's just useless. We would have actually done something humane, sensible, practical, and economically sound.
So do you think that was a bit of a turning point of?
No, no. I mean, it was just another step. It's just a trend.
It was incremental.
Yeah, incremental. And as McCain always lamented about immigration, and he took 3 giant tries at it at considerable political cost to himself, was that it's just not that hard of a problem. We've politics, because you've got some people fired up to think, it's just, there's, these Mexicans are coming here and taking our jobs. So here's what happens when Mexicans get deported from the local meatpacking plant. Nobody takes those jobs.
Yeah.
No locals take the jobs. As McCain always put it, I can offer $50 an hour to some native-born American to pick lettuce in Yuma, Arizona in August, and I won't get one guy to do it, and that's like every other wave of immigrants. They're prepared to start on the bottom rung of opportunity in this country and work their way up. And they're quite successful at it. And they're quite a credit to this country and quite valuable to us. Immigrants generally make us a better country with every immigration wave. But they've fired up people who really don't know better to believe that it's some attack on their kind of America. There's a cultural, and not with everybody, but there's an element of racism in it. And they've turned a medium-sized problem into this insoluble one. He just found that ridiculous. As he used to say, it's not Medicare. I don't know how we're going to make Medicare solvent in 20 years. It's not. It's why we can't do this. We can't get this done. He was his last great moment in the Senate. Really, his last great statement was when he flew back. Just a few days after being operated and having a brain tumor, or most of a brain tumor removed. And
that felt iconic, that moment.
It was. And he walked in, and he was, not everybody loved him in the Senate, but he was very widely respected and loved by many people. He was a fun guy to be around, and charming, and like his mom was. But he walked into an ovation. Funny, very funny. He was exhilarating to be around, and he gave this speech, and his speech was essentially, we called it the regular order speech, which sounds very arcane and esoteric. But he said, we've decided that we can have all the loaf all the time, and we don't get anything done. It's arrogance on all our parts, and we're aggregating all the power in this place to the leadership. So at that time, what was happening was the Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership in the Senate were working on a, quote, alternative to Obamacare that McCain would end up voting against 2 days later in the famous thumbs down thing. But, 'cause, 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 it wasn't an alternative. Obviously, it was going to repeal certain select parts of Obamacare and basically fatally wound it, so that nobody would really have it. And um, that wasn't being done by the committee of jurisdiction, the health committee. It was being done by leadership staff. And McCain said, why are we letting the leaders decide for us? The committees would be where most of the real compromising got done, because you spend most of your time on the committees you're assigned to. You get to know members of the committee better than you know other members.
But you say that doesn't happen
even
anymore.
members. Well, it does to an extent. On certain armed service still does. Intelligence still does. The Senate Intelligence Committee came out with a pretty damning report on Russia that somehow got lost in the great miasma of Trump's
Trump land.
But it was, and Marco Rubio signed off on it, who was temporarily, the Republican chair. So there are a few committees where it's still done, but not like it used to be. And those relationships with those committee members were always cross aisle. You would know Democrats on your committee better than you'd know a lot of guys in your own caucus. And that's where deals got done. You had dinner, all that kind of stuff. And the more and more it gets done by staff in the leader's office, the less and less that happens, and the less opportunity is to really we can't get anything done that lasts, it sticks, because with every change in majority, out goes this.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. I can't remember what the numbers are, but go see how many Republicans voted for Medicare. That's why it's still here. It's
well, and the thing that we'll get to current events in a minute, but I want to talk about two more things before we get to that.
Mm-hmm.
One is because I think it's so representative of what McCain stood for. Is there was a series of protests in the Ukraine
mm-hmm.
after President Yanukovych voted against them joining the European Union at Putin's insistence.
Yeah.
And McCain was there with, I think, Chris Murphy.
Yep.
And what was it about what was happening there that, to my observation, epitomized what John McCain cared about?
Well, he cared. He looked at this country the way Lincoln sort of saw it. It's an almost sacred project to prove that self-government is the only moral government, and that every human being is entitled to it. And so he identified with every freedom movement, every I mean, it could be 10 people in a distant, remote third world place, and somehow John McCain would do something for them. But he was very, very moved by what are called the Maidan, the Euromaidan rallies, protests, where you had 500,000 or more people in that square every night in the wintertime, and
protesting at great personal risk.
And there were thugs were murdering them and beating them and all that kind of stuff. And he was he told me that the first night he went to the square, he was in a trade union building or something on the edge of the square and looking down at it, and they were all holding their lights on their phones, and he says he was just indescribably moving to me, that he's so hopeful, after all this corruption, with successive different governments and corruption, and Putin always the heavy hand of Russia, and this one will probably get squashed too. There's just something so brave, so persistent, so hopeful in human nature, to believe in their own autonomy so much that they hope that they would be able to live as free people and choose their own government. And the next day he was asked by the protest leaders to speak, and it was translated, and he did, and he said it was one of the great honors of his life. But he was tremendously moved by it.
And tell us about the warm friendship between McCain and Putin.
Yeah, well, yeah, he had Putin as early as 2000, I think, or 1999 even. Whenever he said something when he ran for president the first time about you got to watch this guy Putin. He's up to no good or something like that. And then he was a harsh critic all along and saw it coming because Putin was supposed to have been a sort of a technocrat. Yes, he was a KGB guy, but he was supposed to be this sort of modern, practical guy. And it turned out he was, a little bit of a Stalin, but
Or a lot of bit of a Stalin.
well, I don't think he's murdered.
Killing as many people.
Yeah, he hasn't killed as many, but he's killed plenty. He was always convinced Putin was trying to reconstitute as much of the old Soviet Union as he could reassemble, and Ukraine obviously was the most important republic that that gained its independence after the Cold War. So he was very close to our ambassador there. I'm often asked, how would McCain have voted on the impeachment? Would he have voted like Romney? I'm always reluctant to say what he would have done when he's no longer here to tell me what he would have done. I think that's unfair of me. But all I know is he despised Putin. He thought the world of our ambassador there. He spent one of his last New Year's on the front lines in the eastern Ukraine with Ukrainian Marines, Amy Klobuchar, our ambassador, and Lindsey Graham, and said, again, that was one of the highlights of his life. And so I got a vague idea he wouldn't have been too happy with the President of the United States trying to bribe a sovereign government to dummy up a bad report on his likely opponent. So you taking a dim view of that.
Yeah, we'll get to Trump, but we can't not have a conversation and talk about why did McCain, he was in great standing in the Senate, he was in really good shape, decide to run for president?
The second time?
Both times.
Both times. The first time was almost a little bit of I don't want to call it a lark, but he went into it realistic. George W. Bush was sort of the anointed, the prohibitive favorite, had most of the establishment in the party lined up behind him, had most of the donors, that's for sure. And, had a lot of talented guys and girls and, had a virtual, built himself kind of almost an administration down there, a cabinet and in Austin. And they liked each other, he and Bush, there was no hard feelings. So McCain thought very highly of then Governor Bush's father. He thought he was a wonderful president. But he had this sort of, what do I got to lose attitude. And at the time he was just beginning his sort of long, he was a couple of years into it or a few years into, calling for a ban on soft money and other campaign finance reforms. So why didn't I run as a Republican on campaign finance reform? Not your first, not sort of your instinctive,
right?
Yeah, but instinctive to him, because it became a broader reform message. It became something like, I can't fix Medicare, I can't fix our broken procurement system, I can't fix no president can unless I first get all these 7-figure donations, all this money washing around, as he put it, in our politics, out, and because it stops us from getting a lot of stuff done that we need to do. What it does, it most of that money goes for preserving the status quo. So that turned out to be a pretty winning message. He also he was a great campaigner in this way, and not a great orator, but a great back and forth kind of guy with audiences. In the state that's primary is really equipped for that is New Hampshire, where you really do it town hall by town hall. And I think he did like 110 town halls, and by the time they were over, they were like a circus. Tons of media then by that time, but just all these crazy people would show up, and he'd call them all up on stage, and all right, 5 minutes, give me your, and he would spar back and forth with questioners, and they loved it, and he wasn't afraid to say, "Yup, you're wrong," and he wasn't afraid to get booed, and it became. He just captured something, but we didn't, we had nowhere near the resources that they had. And so they ground us down in South Carolina and later primaries, but we always had very nostalgic views of 2000, and if you asked,
Feels like it was his time, right?
Yes, it was. And I'm pretty confident he would have beat Al Gore by, obviously Bush lost the popular vote to Gore, but he always looked at that. I think it was probably one of the highlights of his career.
Was running. In 2000.
In 2000. And when we started talking in 2005 and 2006 about running again, when he might have been the early front runner, he repeatedly raised with me and other advisors, the question, can we bottle lightning twice? He was skeptical that he could. And that was not as much fun. He became the nominee. It was a great honor, and he was very moved by the honor, and it was special to him. Don't get me wrong. And he's a very competitive guy. He does not like to lose, or did not like to lose. But he, it was the campaign blew up, and a lot of friendships were sundered in the first year. And then, we sort of he slugged his way back to contention and became the nominee. And then, running against a guy that had captured everybody's imagination on an even grander scale than McCain had managed to do in a Republican primary 8 years earlier.
Do you think he was sorry he ran in 2008?
I don't know the answer to that. He would never told me if he had been. I don't think so. I think he thought, I managed to become the nominee. And we had a window. We came out of that convention with a 5-point lead. Convention bounces often disappear, but ours didn't really disappear. We were probably tied. Maybe Obama was up a point or two, but we were certainly in contention when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And then there was not really anything we could do. I mean, we looked a little desperate. The reporter said, well, that, canceling to go back to Washington and get in the middle of this seemed a little desperate. He said, well, because we were, because the market's selling off 800 points. The global credit system is collapsing. The wrong track number in the country in the polls, the right track, wrong track was 88 wrong track. And we were unfortunately saddled. We were the Republican running to succeed a Republican. So we were saddled with George Bush's third term. There's virtually nothing we could have done. So yeah, we looked a little like we were a little prone to Hail Mary passes. I mean, it's hard to come up with let's run the ball a couple of yards.
So what everybody always wants to ask about for the 2008 campaign, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about it over the years, have two parts. One, they would say that McCain lost because he picked Sarah Palin.
That's not true.
And the other is you publicly said that you were in favor of Tim Pawlenty.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you felt disappointed that McCain nonetheless went with Sarah Palin.
Well, two things. She didn't cost him the race. We could have. There's nobody we could have had on the ticket that would have made any difference after Lehman Brothers. And she did animate certain Republicans or certain voters, independent voters, who weren't very enthusiastic about voting for McCain. She did cost him some of the, centrist, center-right independents, but it kind of a wash at the end of the day. He also felt responsible for putting her on the ticket. His reason was not to fire up the base or the sort of Trump base that we weren't, I think, really, but that we didn't comprehend existed at the time. It was really because, first he wanted to put a Democrat or a former Democrat on the ticket, and his staff and various senior people in the Republican Party, national leaders of the Republican Party, prevailed on him not to pick that person.
Because he couldn't have come out of the convention?
Well, we could have come out of it, but boy, it would have been bloody. There would have been a challenge on the floor because the person was Joe Lieberman, and Lieberman was pro-choice, and the party is decidedly pro-life now, and that would have been a bloody, bloody fight. And the press would have written it up as McCain comes out of his convention crippled. And we weren't. It's not like we went into it with a lead.
Right.
But and so he, then there were other choices. There was Mitt Romney and Tim Pawlenty, and rather late in the game, one senior advisor told him, "Let's take a look at this new governor in Alaska. that she ran as a reformer. She took on the Republican establishment.
So she
in
seemed
Alaska. She
mavericky.
seemed mavericky. She was, mom, with, I mean, McCain didn't know her. He'd met her once, but he really didn't know her at all. But one person on our campaign who'd worked in Alaska was familiar with her and said, she's impressive. She's impressive. And so I was asked to go with another aide to meet with her secretly in Flagstaff. And we kind of asked her a lot of policy questions and talked to her about, her responsibilities should she be asked to be on the ticket. And then we put her on the phone with lawyers who had already been vetting her, but asked her a lot of uncomfortable questions about a lot of things, and worked through the night. And then we brought her down to meet with McCain. She and McCain had an hour or so conversation, we were in his place in northern Arizona, which was his favorite place on earth. And he was sitting in the chairs at the bend of this creek that runs along their property, which was his favorite place to sit. And they were there an hour and a half or something. And then I and this other aide left with him to go to a room, and where we sort of debated his options. And I decided I would advocate for Pawlenty. I like and admire Governor Romney very much, but I thought if he asked Governor Romney to be on the ticket, that we would spend the first week or so relitigating all the issues that they had argued about in the primaries, all the attacks on each other. And I said, you know what, we don't have enough time to do that. And I thought I liked Governor Pawlenty very much. I thought he was a very talented politician and a good guy, and a nice center-right guy with good policy views. And but it would have been greeted by a respectable pick, yes, and then nobody would have paid any attention to it. The other advocacy was for Sarah Palin, who will get a ton of attention because nobody knows who she is to start with, and the people advocating for her thought that she could withstand the pressure. Didn't know for sure, but thought she could. And she had some very winning ways. And he would get a little. There was every election to an extent is a change election, but 2008 was a change election on steroids, which is why hope and change was in every mailer communication that the Obama campaign issued. And we had to get a piece of that change message. McCain had been the change candidate in 2000. We had to get a piece of it because whoever was the biggest change on offer was going to win that election. We had to do something. And we thought, okay, we'll put a woman on the ticket, and she's a newcomer, but she's very mavericky and a reformer, and let's give it a shot. And it was a gamble, and one of the vetters told McCain, high risk, high reward. And he gambled. And, it wasn't fair to her because she wasn't ready. My argument to McCain was, you would pick her at the cost of country first, or the experience argument we've been making against Obama. But, the pushback from others on the campaign was correct, that, the experience argument doesn't mean crap in 2008 to voters. They want change. And they don't care if you haven't been in government for one day. I didn't really accurately appreciate just how widely spread that sentiment is among some American voters, even people who don't normally vote, until Donald Trump got elected, when they picked a guy that is so transparently unqualified for the job, almost because of that fact. But anyway. It didn't work out to anyone's great satisfaction, but that's not her fault. That's ours.
So speaking of presidential campaigns and Trump, you were part of a team running a presidential campaign. So what do you think the Biden and Trump teams are doing as we speak? What's going on?
I think the Trump campaign probably lives in mortal terror of encounters with their candidate, but the Biden campaign is doing a pretty good job, as far as I can tell. I can't imagine how they're managing to do it, because they are, like so many people, they're doing it remotely. I think all the Trump people in true Trumpian style are huddled together in a building in Northern Virginia, and the Biden campaign staff are, working from their homes. I don't
Still?
Yeah, I think I haven't. I've got a few friends that work on the campaign. Well, my college roommate is Mike Downland, his chief strategist, and I haven't talked to him in a while.
He's busy.
Well, when I send him a text, I get like literally one syllable responses, so I try not to bother him. But he.
Although you were in touch with them when you were doing the.
Yeah, they were. I helped organize McCain alumni for Biden, and they were very gracious in their time with us.
So, Mark, you read a lot about that Trump now controls the Republican Party, that it's not the GOP, it's Trump's party. Legislators seem to be terrified of his power and, relent. You talked a little bit when you were talking about Sarah Palin about people wanting an outsider, but what was it that the Republican Party missed leading up to Trump that created this void that allowed this man that, as you said, is totally incapable, incompetent of running the country to actually get elected?
Yeah. I don't know, Roxanne. I think Trump's hold, which is somewhat of a reign of terror over other Republicans, will go away when he's gone.
You do?
Well, I think his personal hold, nobody's going to, I guarantee you, even the most slavishly sycophantic member is going to heave a sigh of relief, Republican member of Congress, maybe not some of the Freedom Caucus knuckleheads, but most Republican senators I know, with a couple of exceptions, will heave a sigh of relief when that guy's gone. One, he's going to probably cost them the Senate. And two, you can see it on the news. As they're walking in the hallways, usually the reporter stops them. They're pretty cheerful people. Why not? It's great job.
But why are these seemingly rational people succumbing this way? I mean, it's inconceivable as you watch the news and Trump does one more.
I think there are various. I can't.
There's not an answer.
I'm just speculating.
Good. Well, go ahead.
Okay. So some will fear a primary because, the people, oftentimes the fringiest elements in either party, they're the ones who show up the most. They show up to every precinct committee meeting. They make themselves a real, their presence known. We experienced that in Arizona. McCain always had a problem with about 25% of Republican voters, the most conservatives, and they controlled the district. They ran everything because they showed up, and your Chamber of Commerce Republican, is not going to go.
Didn't show up.
Show up some schoolroom to get yelled at by strangers for a half hour every other week or something. So, no. But so they're worried that, they get primary and the most energetic and reliable votes would be against them in a primary. Others, I think, probably think, well, if we work with him or somewhere and let him sign big checks or whatever he does, we can make him 10% less insane. We'll control
it's not
him,
working.
at the same time get the judges we want and the regulations cut we want and the tax cuts we want. And there's, in some ways that's happened. They haven't managed to keep 10% less insane, mind you, but they got the tax cuts, the tax code they wanted.
And they're getting the Supreme Court justices.
And they're getting all sorts of judges. So in some ways that worked out. And I'm sure there are other motives. And in a few cases in the Senate, they may think populism is the way to go. Now there'll be a contest, not for Trump, because he's an albatross around their necks now, and they know it. It's probably going to cost them the Senate. And he's been a terrible, terrible, terrible president. Really, right there with Buchanan and Andrew Johnson is maybe the worst presidents we've ever had, maybe the very worst. And he's, I think, in my own opinion, a clear and present danger to this country. He is an antagonist to our allies and a sycophant to our enemies, and that is dangerous business in the world we live in today. And as far as I'm concerned, we can't get him out of there fast enough.
And Mark, on that subject of bailing on our allies and embracing the authoritarians out there, given what that sort of role for the United States had with McCain, what do you think it's going to take to get that back?
It's going to be,
and is something permanently lost?
in my own view, to an extent, but in a very different way. I felt the previous administration was negligent overseas, but it was sort of but there was a benevolence behind it. We shouldn't,
like Syria.
We shouldn't be dictating. We shouldn't be. But our allies may grumble sometimes about the heavy hand of American leadership, but what worries them most is when that hand has completely disappeared.
Yeah,
and the hand got,
and that's what's going on.
The hand got a little loose in the Obama administration. Trump is an antagonist. That's entirely different. When American leadership becomes an antagonist to you, that's a very different thing. So the world has now had, in my opinion, 8 years of not strong enough American leadership and 4 years of open hostility from the President of the United States. Another 4 years of Trump, NATO won't exist. Hello.
Eric, are we good?
Yeah, we only lost about 10 seconds of audio.
Okay. All right, good.
So anyway, I don't think NATO would survive a second Trump term. I think the Europeans will form their own defense alliance without us, and it'll be Europeans, figuring out how to deal with the emergence of China and the sort of
it's a scary picture.
The aggressiveness of Putin's Russia. I mean, eventually Russia. I mean, it's just they have one thing to sell: gas and oil, and a ton of corruption. Russia's living in the twilight of its greatness,
but China is
not,
else.
and that's a major issue we're going to have to manage. And I can't think of anybody less competent to do that and to rally our allies in some kind of unified approach relationship with China than Donald Trump. He's utterly incapable. You might as well ask, I don't know, it's just a trained monkey to do it.
Mark, one of the things that a lot of us thought was law in terms of what a president of the United States could do turns out to be custom. I mean, Trump pulls off one outrageous thing after another. We go, that must be against the law. That must be against the law.
Well, I mean, there are certain things you should litigate, but the politics means the litigation takes too long and the politics move on. So, for instance, all those ignored subpoenas, you can go to court and try to enforce them from Congress, but it'll be litigated for months and years,
But do you think there'll be an appetite for rolling back executive power? I mean, executive power has been expanded.
I would hope so, and I think there might definitely be an appetite on the Democratic side for that, but. I think the Republicans are going to have to sort out. There will be members of the Republican Party, seeking leadership positions, running for president. We still on?
Are we on?
Yeah.
We think we're on.
Okay.
All right.
Who will try to do some version of Trump's nativism, populism, is managed trade or protectionism. They'll try to do some version of it without the crazy tweets, and the obviously insecure,
childishness.
Yeah, childishness that Donald Trump exhibits so often. Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton, they'll beat up immigrants. They'll make cynical arguments about trade relationships. They'll do all sorts of stuff that's unpleasant, but they'll try to do it in a way that's recognizably normal and not insane. And then there'll be others who will represents something else, I think. And there'll be a battle, and it'll probably go on for more than one election. There'll be a battle. I don't, any party that plans to succeed by discouraging people from voting is not a party with a future.
Let's hope.
And but well, I hope there is a center-right party with a future in this country, because I'm a center-right guy and I believe in it. And you don't want the most progressive elements of the Democratic Party, in my viewpoint, to take over the great Democratic Party, because I think their ideas are kind of nutty at times. But having said that, I'm not optimistic about the Republican Party. Demographics are against it. We can't go around doing all these things to tell people, we really don't like you, and we're going to try to stop you from voting. And, we look at you as our adversaries and exist in a country. 60% of the high school seniors in the state of Arizona today are Hispanic. They're friends. They've got friends who are being deported. Those are searing events in the life of a child. They're going to remember that. They're going to remember who did that. It's just crazy. Texas looks like it might be a battleground this election, but in 10, 15 years, it's going to be blue. And no Republican will ever win a presidential election again. So we've got to either change, and I hope we don't spend a whole lot of time fighting back against the people that want to take us further down the direction that Donald Trump took us, just being more courteous on Twitter.
I know you don't like to speculate on what McCain would say about something that's happening after his death. And Kevin, my husband, said that all during the hearings today, people on both sides were bringing up McCain's name as, working together with everyone, and we don't want to be divisive. What do you think? Not what McCain would have thought of the nominee.
Plug the book while there's
about the procedure that they're deciding to vote on.
Okay, I personally don't have a problem with the nominee. I do have a problem with how it was done, and not that they violated any rule, and it doesn't qualify as court packing. They are the rules as they exist. It's perfectly constitutional what Republicans are doing. But 4 years ago, we denied President Obama his choice of a nominee because we controlled the Senate. And we didn't make the argument that, sorry, we control the Senate, we're not gonna confirm your nominee. We said, we're not gonna give your nominee a vote because it's within an election year and we should let the people decide. We made that argument 1,000 times. John McCain made that argument at the behest of leaders. Lindsey Graham made that argument at the behest of leaders. Every Republican I know in the Senate made that argument. Okay. And then to reverse course like that, to me, it just, again, undermines any bonds, just weakens any remaining bonds, cross aisle bonds. Any people, you've got to be good for your word in politics. If you're not good to your word, the place just comes apart. And so the way it's been done is what I'm opposed to, and why I wouldn't have supported this nominee. Not because I have a problem with 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. I don't.
So I want to go to the close of the book, and for all of you that are listening, I left out one chapter after another that would stand alone as a incredible kind of history, and what I've described the book as is inspiring. That, I know Mark Salter to be a pessimist, and McCain, who was an optimist, who, despite the corruption and the cruelty that was around, really understood the possibility, and that you would keep working to it. Yeah. So in the closing line of your last book, which you referred to, is what an ingrate, this is quoting John McCain, what an ingrate I would be to curse the fate that concludes the blessed life I've led. I hope those that mourn my passing, and even those who don't, will celebrate as I celebrate a happy life lived in imperfect service to a country made of ideals whose continued success is the hope of the world. And I wish all of you great adventures, good company, and lives as lucky as mine. How did this notion of his, Mark, inform you and him about what his funeral should be?
Well, I titled the book Luckiest Man for a reason. He really did view himself as the luckiest man, not only for surviving, a half a dozen very close brushes with death, but, to have overcome what he recognized were his own imperfections, his flaws and failings, his temper, his impetuosity, to become, as he used to put it, fifth from the bottom of my class at the Naval Academy and the Republican nominee for president. Unbelievable. And his very last moments on earth, he stressed over and over again how fortunate he believed he was and how he should be viewed that way, because his greatest fortune, he felt, being able to work in service to this country, because he really did believe in this country's ideals. And I think what prison taught him, and what his affinity and association with freedom movements the world over taught him, that the most marvelous of human achievements is to not lose hope when experience has taught you hope is for suckers. And he never did. And that was the most valuable lesson he taught me. He taught me to believe in hope when I have a somewhat grimmer, darker expectation of humanity. And it really was the source of his strength and his, his great impact, I think, on his country.
And he made a decision with you about who would speak at the funeral.
He did, yeah. He asked, he wanted to send a sign that far more unites us and divides us. So he asked the two men who denied him the presidency, Barack Obama and George Bush, to speak on his behalf at his funeral. And that was a classic McCain gesture. If you ever want to have your faith in what restored and what politics can be, go back and look again at his concession speech in 2008 and the speech he gave at the Al Smith dinner a few weeks before that concession speech. They really are restorative, I think. They really
Yeah.
are, yeah.
And I think for the world, the funeral, in the midst of so much cynicism, reminded all of us that was possible.
Yes, it did. For a moment. But
well,
it was quite a moment.
It was quite a moment. And, we were here in Maine when you got that call.
Yeah.
And describe getting that call. And
well, we have a daughter who was in the Peace Corps at the time, and she'd come home for a week. I'd been shuttling back and forth to Arizona for most of that year, his last year. Cindy called me a week or so before and said he was entering kind of the final stages of his disease, and I should be ready to come back at a moment's notice. And so I got a call from her again saying, come back. And I waited overnight because my daughter was here, and I caught a flight in the morning. And I flew the whole way thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to get there in time. And I didn't even get Wi-Fi on the plane. But when I landed, I got a text from Rick Davis, who was there and had been calling me, saying he's still hanging in there. It takes a few hours to get the rental car, or I think they had somebody pick me up. But it's about a 2-hour drive to their place in northern Arizona. But I did get there in time, and I was there to pass. Otherwise, I would have felt guilty for a long time. But it was a lovely, peaceful departure from this earth, just the way he would have wanted it. He was in a bed on the deck of his home, looking at the place he loved, and the Blackhawks that he sort of had a fascination for. One of them flew over him, and he died a moment later. It was very, very nice. We drove to the top of the hill an hour or so later with the hearse, and there were crowds of people all along the county roads and the interstate, and in the city of Phoenix, all around the blocks to the funeral home, and then to the state capitol where he laid in state. And there were long lines at the U.S. Capitol where he laid in state after that. And there was just the outpouring of admiration and affection for the guy was extremely heartening. And to this day, if I even summon an image of it, it makes me pretty weepy. But it was, it was a great moment for a great man, and I was glad I got to witness it.
Mark, I'd like to close with one of the most exquisite chapters in the book. Closes with, I'll have you set up the story. Okay. It's the end of the campaign. Yeah. John McCain, as you said, was a voracious reader and a Hemingway fan, and he pulls out of his briefcase this sort of torn up copy of the Snows of Kilimanjaro and proceeds to read the whole thing. And it's not a short story, it's more of a novella.
Yeah, it's a long one.
But he read it for an hour.
Yeah.
And this ending to the paragraph, to the chapter, I think, reminded me of John McCain, the man, reminds me, Mark, of your incredible talent and ability to tell the stories. And I think reminds us of what's possible. So if you would read that. I'm going to have you go close to the mic.
Okay, well, I think I should back it up to just read the little.
Okay.
So the story, for those of you who haven't read it, begins with a little, almost like a National Geographic paragraph or something, but a little comment on the Kilimanjaro itself. Kilimanjaro. So this is listen to this. This is McCain. Listen to this, he ordered, and he began to read the story. This is how the story begins. Kilimanjaro is a snow-covered mountain, 19,710 feet high, and is said to be the highest mountain in Africa. Its western summit is called the Masai Nagaji Nage, the House of God. Close to the western summit, there is the dried and frozen carcass of a leopard. No one has explained what the leopard was seeking at that altitude. He read the entire story aloud. It's long for a short story, more than 9,000 words. It took him over an hour to read, and he was hoarse when he finished. For those who've never had the pleasure, it's the story of a rider on African safari, dying of a gangrene, aware of his predicament, and reflecting back on his life's choices. I had always considered it a story of heartbreaking regret, an odd choice, or maybe not, for a candidate in a presidential election. But I don't think McCain's impulse to read it had a thing to do with his present circumstances. I don't think for him the story was about regret. It was a story of aspiration. At the end of it, in his delirium as death approaches, the protagonist believes he is aloft in an airplane flying through a violent storm until he sees the square top of Kilimanjaro looking as wide as all the world, great, high, and unbelievably white in the sun. McCain struggled to finish the story's last paragraphs as his small audience, frozen and silent, shot furtive glances at each other. He had read the story 100 times by his account, and on the 101st time, he cried at the end. It's beautiful, he explained, beautiful. What was the leopard seeking at that altitude? To leave below the regrets of a life, to make up for its failings, to ascend by courage and good work and sacrifice until your conscience was quiet in appreciation of the steep climb. What was the leopard seeking at that altitude? Its best self, its honor.
Well, congratulations,
Thank you.
my friend.
Thank you very much.
Your book brings enormous honor to John McCain, and I know that would matter to you. So a virtual applause from everybody.
Thank you all thanks you all. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Yeah, so now bear in mind that I am a bookseller. This is a book that, oh good, all the hands, thank you. And I want to encourage you to not only read the book and buy the book, but think about giving this to others, because having read this, having read all of Mark's books before that he's written with McCain, this one does something that I think we all need now, and that is to remember that there's a lot of goodness and there's a lot of possibility, and we're not getting a lot of that. So Thank you for that, Mr. Salter. Thank you all for being so patient.
Thank you.
Sorry we went so over. Thanks for joining us.